I'd like to call to order Global Source Committee meeting of March 15th, 2019. It's 9:01 a.m. Let's see, is everyone present? I see Dr. Liu and I see Mayor Mitchell and Mayor McCallum. Let's see, is boardroom is with us is Mrs. Supervisor Bartlett.
Hello.
And hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
And I guess Supervisor Perez is not
Arrived yet.
there this morning yet, has arrived. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to have our update on the Pacific Rim Initiative for Maritime Emission Reductions by Sarah Reese. Dr. Reese, go right ahead.
Great. Good morning, Dr. Parker, members of the committee. My name is Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer here at the district in planning. And I'm just going to give a bit more of a deeper dive, no pun intended, on our Pacific Rim Initiative for Maritime Emission Reductions. I've mentioned this before as we've been giving updates on our facility-based measures, so we just want to give some more details on what we're thinking about and some of the work that we've been doing. So just an overview of my presentation. I'm first going to cover the importance of ship emissions and why this matters for us, give an introduction of our concept and the work that we've been doing, talk a bit of some of the opportunities we see for retrofits for vessel engines and some technology demonstration projects, and then quickly cover our next steps. So first, going into the importance of ship emissions. Right now, heavy-duty trucks are our #1 source of NOx in the basin, but in the near future, it's going to be ships. You can see that in 2012, trucks, other sources, mobile sources, are predominant in terms of NOx. But as we get into 2023, it's really the ships and commercial boats. And that's because we have other ways of getting emission reductions from these other sources, but not really for ships. And then when you look at the emissions from Port of LA and Long Beach, it's really the ocean-going vessels, the big ships that are over half the emissions in 2015. We expect that probably is going to go up over time as we have other methods of being able to get emission reductions from trucks, for example, but we don't really have much control over the emissions from ships. So a couple of challenges in trying to address emissions from ships. First, as you're aware, we have limited regulatory authority in this arena. Most mobile sources are subject to CARB authority or EPA authority. In terms of the vessel emissions, there's another layer of international regulations that take control. And then second challenge is the international regulations that are on books really aren't sufficient to get NOx emission reductions, at least in terms of our needs. There are regulations on the books right now that require cleaner engines for NOx on these vessels. We call them Tier 3 engines, but these are really just for the emission control areas, and I'll cover what those look like in later slides. And it's really only for vessels that have been built after 2016, so a fairly limited number of vessels. And then another complication with this is that when I say built after 2016, it's really about when the keel is laid for these vessels. And there was a glut of keels that were laid just before 2016. I'll also show that in future slides, and it's quite shocking. So there's kind of a loophole in terms of these regulations applying. We also have regulations on low sulfur fuels. Those have been in place for a while. Again, these are international regulations. They're by the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body. And so starting in January 1, 2020, the what we call the global sulfur cap is lowering. So fuel sulfur will go down from about 3.5% to 0.5%. Within emission control areas, it's already very low. It's at 0.1%. So, and that's also consistent with what we have in CARB. So vessels are able to comply with those limits either by buying lower sulfur fuels or by installing scrubbers. However, in emission control areas, they have, or at least in California, they have to have the low sulfur fuels. Having these regulations on low sulfur fuels helps not only in terms of lowering sulfur, but lowering PM, but it doesn't really help us anything on NOx. So you have this body of regulations in place. That's really a lot of what the focus is internationally right now, but it doesn't really get you any NOx emission reductions. So here's what the regulations currently look like internationally for NOx. I mentioned there are different tiers of vessels. The Tier 3 vessels are the ones that are cleanest for NOx. Again, these are just for in emission control areas, but they're significantly cleaner than the other tiers. You look at the Tier 0s, you're effectively your uncontrolled emissions. Tier 1, those are for vessels that were built after 2000. Tier 2, maybe 15% cleaner than Tier 1, but you really get that big difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3. And that's important to note because that's why, it's one of the reasons why we're very interested in retrofits, that perhaps if we can get a vessel that's a Tier 2 plus in terms of NOx control, that still gets us a lot of NOx emission reductions. Here's what the current emission control areas look like. You can see they're maybe not as clearly marked here, but they're in the dark blue around the coast. So you can see there's a North American and Caribbean emission control area around the coast of North America. There's also an emission control area in the North Sea and Baltic. Those will be adding NOx emission reduction requirements in 2021. And then the yellow dots in China, those are relatively new emission control areas, or they call them emission control zones. They have been in place for SO2. They've recently added controls for NOx as well. So this is something that China is also looking at. Interesting to note that the emission control areas, these are again set up by the International Maritime Organization. We call them emission control zones in China because the Chinese ones haven't been sanctioned by IMO. China just went ahead and decided to do their own thing, which is not necessarily unusual, but they have a similar regulatory purpose. So one of our issues is very few Tier 3 vessels right now are being built. One of the reasons for that is, as you can imagine, these vessels, they have these massive engines, they last for many, many years. They could be out there for 30 or 40 years before they're replaced. So you don't have a lot of turnover in that fleet. But another reason is that for the emission control areas, there's nothing that prevent a Tier 0 through a Tier 2 vessel from entering those areas. So there's not really an incentive to have to turn your fleet over or upgrade to meet this new regulatory purpose. We think there's probably a handful of Tier 3 vessels that are out there right now. I mentioned before that there's a surplus of the pre-2016 Keels that are out there. So if I wanted to buy a new vessel today, I could run out and buy a new vessel, but it'd still be down to Tier 2 standards and probably less expensive than buying a Tier 3 one. Both of our ports have incentive programs in place today to attract Tier 3 vessels. So far, those incentive programs have not resulted in any Tier 3 vessels visiting our ports. We've had a few false alarms where we thought some have visited, but that has not turned out to be the case. In 2016, around 80% of the vessel calls were either Tier 0 or Tier 1, so fairly dirty in terms of NOx. And the ports don't project that we'll have any Tier 3 vessels visiting our area until the 2030s or 2040s. This is a chart I was talking about in terms of illustrating the keel laid issues. So you can see fairly low numbers of keels were laid leading up to this level. Some of that was due to the economic recession where people just weren't building as many boats. You can see this massive spike in 2015 of keels were laid. A lot of these are still hanging around, and it's a little unclear how many have been committed to in terms of construction, but we think there's probably some opportunity to be able to influence decisions in the shipping industry to have those pre-2016 keels constructed to Tier 3 standards. So this just gives you an idea of existing regulations that are in place in California that govern vessels. We have, CARB has existing regulations that apply to for shore power. And so we have, that's also in place. CARB is also continuing to develop their At-Berth regulations, and so those are also coming in place. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of what the overall regulatory picture looks like in California. Again, we're going to get some emission reduction in terms of NOx, but it's really not going to get at the big source, which is the engines, both the main engines of these vessels and then the auxiliary engines. So with that all in mind, we're kind of scratching our heads as to what could we do to try, with our limited authority, with all these hurdles in place, to try to get at something that would result in cleaner vessels coming to our shores. And one idea we had is that we know that these vessels are on a circuit. They visit our ports, they visit other ports on the West Coast, they go over to China and Asia, and then they come back. And so we know that China also suffers from air quality issues. They've been very focused on VOC reduction and PM reduction, but they're starting to understand that their ozone issues are also impacted by NOx. And so an idea is maybe there's a way in which we could partner with ports in China. Maybe they could either have a regulation or some incentive programs that could work with existing incentive programs that we would have at our ports and on the West Coast. And then maybe all of a sudden, if a vessel calling at all these ports were to be able to collect an incentive at them, that might be, in accumulation, enough to change behavior in the shipping industry. The map I have up here is a sample of an actual route by CMA CGM. It's a big shipping line, and so that's a route that they currently use, where you can see the vessel goes up to Prince Rupert in Canada, comes down to Long Beach, up to Oakland, over to Asia, and then back up again. So in terms of kind of fleshing this concept out, what we wanted to do is identify top ports in China that are on the same routes as the ports for the ships that visit the ports of LA and Long Beach. See if there's some interest over there in collaborating with us and working on with us to develop a joint program for incentives. And then figuring out what those incentives should look like in terms of being sufficient to change shipping behavior. And there's a couple of ways we want to target this. First, we want to figure out a way to attract those small handful of Tier 3 vessels that are out there in the fleet. We want them coming over to us. Right now, we think most of them go to Europe, so we want them to come here instead. Encourage construction of vessels to Tier 3 standards on those Tier 2 keels that are still hanging out there. But then also really take a hard look at retrofits. And retrofits for NOx on ship engines is something that hasn't really been looked at a tremendous amount because there hasn't been a regulatory signal in place. There's really no incentive to do that right now. But as I mentioned before, there's a big gap in terms of NOx emissions between a Tier 2 vessel and a Tier 3 vessel. So if we can figure out perhaps some lower cost technology that we could put on these vessels and get us something in there, it would still be a significant emission reduction for NOx. So the first level of this exercise was figuring out whether there's, enough substance to this. Are there ships that are calling frequently at the ports of LA and Long Beach and also calling frequently at key Chinese ports such that this would be worthwhile? And so what we did is we got a bunch of data. There's satellite tracking data for these vessels, so we can figure out exactly where they go. This is for the year 2016. And what this map shows you are the vessels that called more than 5 times, and these are container vessels, either the ports of Long Beach and LA, and then also called at these key ports in Asia. You can see that Shanghai is the top port where we had shared calls. It's not really a surprise. Shanghai is the biggest port in the world. But then we also have pretty key points of focus in Hong Kong, in Shenzhen, that's the Yantian port, also in Busan in Korea. Japan is also up there. So you can see this, at least for 2016, quite a bit of a promise in terms of vessels that you could target for retrofits or for incentive programs. Now, keep in mind, this is just for 2016. We do know that the shipping industry can be pretty dynamic, and so perhaps these vessels that made these frequent calls are routed to other routes later on. But that's one of the things we want to explore in the incentive program is better understanding how things work in the shipping industry to see what goes into their decision-making processes and whether they could perhaps be there sufficient incentives in place so that they would keep these ships on these routes. This gives you an idea of where the emissions are coming from the different vessels that are calling at our ports. Again, this is just for the year 2016. You can see that most of the emissions are coming from container vessels. Not really surprised. Tankers are number 2, and then the others are kind of a little bit in the noise. But this gives us an idea that perhaps focusing on containerized traffic or the container vessels is a good place for us to start. And then this chart is interesting because it shows you the breakdown in 2016 of the emissions from different operation modes. Now, the main engines associated with these vessels, they're massive. They're kind of like little buildings, little power plants. So you would expect that a lot of these emissions are coming from those main engines in the transiting mode. But we also see that there's emissions coming from the auxiliary engines as well. We see it both in transiting, in maneuvering, in hoteling, and then also in anchoring. And then the next chart will show you that this actually adds up to quite a bit. And so the main engines are about half of the total NOx emissions from OGVs, but the auxiliaries are coming up there as well. And so what this tells us is that not only should we be taking a look at what we can do on main engines, but perhaps there's some opportunity on the auxiliary engines as well. And that's interesting because the auxiliary engines are smaller. They're these smaller four-stroke engines. There's different types of technologies that we could use to retrofit those and get NOx emission reductions there. So there's another opportunity for us to look at. And this chart just gives you an idea of why we're interested in NOx emissions, why when the ships are transiting and maneuvering near shore. It shows that we are getting significant NOx emissions. It's not necessarily right at the ports, and I think that's one question that we get often is that, well, shouldn't you just be focusing on getting emission reductions when these things are sitting in the ports at berth? But we are getting very significant NOx emissions during these transiting modes when they are maneuvering offshore as well. And that does get included in our emission inventory. That does eventually come into our basin and help form ozone emissions. So it's important for us to continue to look at that. In some of our discussions with China, we've seen that at least in Shenzhen, which is an area that's fairly progressive, they've already started looking at some types of incentive programs that are in place. So they're very interested in incentives on low sulfur fuels. They've also been looking at subsidies for shore power and looking to see if there's ways in which they can extend shore power. They've been very interested in the shore power work that's happening at our ports and the relatively high utilization rate we have of shore power versus what they've been able to achieve. They've also been looking at ideas for local ship retrofits. Part of their concern is when they retrofit a ship, they want to make sure it stays in their area, and so they kind of struggle. Similarly, I think to what we would struggle with is if you spend that kind of money, making sure you continue to get that benefit. So far, the incentive programs have had, I'd say, mixed success, but it's interesting because they're one of the few areas in China where you don't have to explain why you would give somebody money to clean up their ship or to clean up their equipment. They get that concept. They get that can get them emission reductions faster and perhaps more cost effectively than straight out regulation, and they also have the resources to be able to pull that off. So just some challenges that we need to be aware of as we go through this. A big key is for us to understand behavior in the shipping industry. It's not my area of expertise. We have to spend a lot of time interviewing folks in the industry, understanding how they decide to route vessels, how they decide to make decisions on purchasing. And we need to understand that so that we can figure out incentive programs that will actually work for them. If we go through all of this effort and have incentive programs in place, either enhanced ones here, other ones in China, and nobody comes to the party, it's sort of a wasted effort. We also need to be able to spend a bunch of time identifying retrofit technologies that are going to work. There's some, and I'll go through the list in a little bit, but some pretty expensive retrofit technologies that are the gold standard, but we think there's some opportunities there of things that are a bit lower tech and a lot cheaper. And then we do need to be cognizant of any trade-off on emissions and disbenefits. Right now in the international maritime world, folks are very, very interested in getting greenhouse gas emission reductions. That was sort of the last initiative that IMO had. They have a target to reach. It's fairly aspirational in the future, but some of these NOx emission control technologies can result in increased greenhouse gas emissions, so we want to be cognizant of that. So in terms of the current status of our primer work, we have started some engagement with China. In August, we met with some officials from the central government in Beijing and also local officials in Hong Kong and Shanghai. We had great interest from the central government, which was very encouraging. It's difficult to do work with local authorities in China if the central government isn't supportive. But they were supportive, and they directed us specifically to go work with Shenzhen and also with Shanghai. Shanghai, again, is the #1 port in the world, so it's important for us to engage with them. Frankly, Shanghai is very concerned with being able to meet their PM targets and their low sulfur targets, and so that has been their focus so far. But they are interested in keeping up to date with what we're doing. We've received a lot more of a positive reaction from Shenzhen. This past January, we traveled to Shenzhen and met with local officials there, and they've kept following up with us since and are very interested in the work that we're doing. In January, we also went out to the MOVE 2019 workshop in Chengdu. That's a workshop that's been based in China. It's held every other year. It's a very large workshop focused generally on transportation, but this time around they had a single day that was dedicated towards maritime industry. And so even though it's based in China, folks from all around the world come there. It was a very good opportunity for us to talk about this concept and get a lot more interest and support for it. We've also been doing some technical analysis to support the concept. So getting more data, trying to better understand shipping patterns, finding out where they've actually traveled, what frequency of their calls, what these routes look like. And then we've hired a consultant to help us do some cost optimization work when the time comes when we have some data on retrofit costs and tier 3 ship costs, and to be able to, maybe figure out what's the sweet spot in terms of amounts of incentives, because you don't want to overpay for incentives and you don't want to underpay for them either. And then we've held a technology forum for ocean-going vessel retrofits. We had that here in December of last year. We convened engine manufacturers, folks from the shipping lines, folks from the ports, and other stakeholders in the maritime industry to really sit down and look at the current state of play of retrofit technologies that are available for NOx emission reductions, both on these large main engines as well as on the four-stroke auxiliary engines. We've gotten a commitment from MAN, which is one of the leading manufacturers of these large engines, to work with us on a technology demonstration project. And we also have a commitment from CMA-CGM, one of the large shipping lines, to help us and provide a vessel that we can use to test this technology out. And the technology we're looking at is a water injection technology. It's relatively low tech, but we think it can get us up to 40% emission reduction in NOx. So this just gives you an idea of the types of retrofit technologies that are out there. I mentioned my gold standard retrofit technology, which is selective catalytic reduction. That's where you inject urea solution and you're able to reduce the NOx down, and so reduce it that way. It's pretty expensive. There's a lot of barriers in terms of using that as a retrofit because it takes up a lot of space. So there's not enough space usually in these engine rooms to be able to put the technology in there. There's also operation costs associated with running it. So usually SCR is something that you would just have on a new built vessel, so one of your tier 3 vessels going out. There's also exhaust gas recirculation. It's another technology that doesn't give you quite as much emission reduction as SCR, but still pretty high. Again, it's expensive, and there can be also these constraints in terms of being able to fit it in an engine room that's already been built. Then we have sort of kind of lower tech technologies, water fuel emulsification. You mix water into the fuel and you're able to reduce NOx because you're reducing combustion temperature of the process. There's also humid air motor, which is kind of an interesting sounding technology where you're just, again, introducing water into the system to lower combustion temperatures that then reduce the amount of NOx that's emitted. So we have a variety of these types of technologies that we're interested in exploring. They've mostly been developed in Scandinavia so far. That's because Norway actually has a NOx emission reduction program for their vessels. It's called the Norwegian Tax Fund, which sounds a little strange, but basically what it is they've put a surcharge on vessels based on their NOx emissions, and if they're able to reduce, they're able to get sort of a break and a benefit on that tax. And so that's actually encouraged a lot of development of these technologies out there. One thing we're also keeping an eye on, it's not here today, but the concept of batteries and hybrids technology for vessels. With these big container ships, we're thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great if you could get like one of these containers be replaced out by a massive battery, and that could be used to offset some of the power used for the auxiliary engines, for example. So again, I don't think that technology is here quite today, but it'll come pretty soon, and it's something that we're keeping an eye on. And this just gives you an idea of the type of emission reductions that we can expect from these different technologies. So again, with SCR, I can get up to a 90% emission reduction. For these lower tech technologies, it's still fairly significant and something that we're therefore pretty interested in. So I mentioned that we already have some commitments to be able to work on a technology demonstration project with MAN Energy Solutions. Wärtsilä is another major manufacturer. They make those four-stroke engines that I was talking about that are used to power auxiliary engines. They're also interested in working with us. I don't think we quite have a commitment with them yet, but they were at our technology forum, and they've been continuing to follow up with us. So we do have a project that's live that we're working on right now. We're still finalizing the details of that project, but we hope to have that up and running starting later this year and then running through 2021. And we do expect to get proposals from Wärtsilä soon. So in terms of our next steps, we definitely have a lot of work to kind of roll up our sleeves and better understand what's going on. I think really getting to understand how shipping lines are making decisions on routing vessels, making decisions on purchasing vessels, that's very key. Better understanding the types of technologies that are out there, how much emission reduction they can get us, what their actual costs will be, is very important. That then feeds into our cost optimization modeling exercise so we can start designing what the actual incentive program would look like. We do expect that we'll have some preliminary results that we hope to be able to share at a conference in Guangzhou, China, coming up in May. That's the International Association of Ports and Harbors. They have their big biennial conference coming up, as mentioned, this May. And so we hope to be able to be there and to be able to show some results of this work. And then continuing to identify some industry partners. We have at least one shipping line who's willing to work with us. It'd be great if we could get some other folks. It'd be really great if we could get one of the Chinese shipping lines to work with us. And so we're continuing to do that. We are convening some working groups. We hope to soon start convening a working group on figuring out ways to better encourage Tier 3 vessel deployments, and then have a technical working group that's focused on this idea of the OGV retrofits. And then we have the whole piece of continuing to build our relationships with our partners in Asia. We've, I think, have a pretty good start on some relationships in China. Certainly, it's been very encouraging, the response we received from Shenzhen. Hong Kong is also very, very interested, and that's a good one because Shenzhen and Hong Kong, the ports are very close to each other, and they already do a lot of work together. And they have already have some platforms in which they're looking to get some emission reductions. And they also see themselves as sort of the leaders in that part of the world in terms of getting emission reductions and want to be out front ahead of everything. And so we're hoping to be able to have more of a launch of our concept, working with Shenzhen's initiative programs. They're looking at amending some of their incentive programs later in 2019. It would be great if we could have our concept sort of folded into that and have some agreement to work together with them. And then we're still continuing to collaborate with other agencies. US EPA has been involved with us as we work along on this. They have their US-China Green Ports and Vessels Initiative, and we've been working closely with the person who heads that up. And then also Port of LA and Port of Long Beach, they have Chinese sister port relationships. One opportunity we'd hope to be able to explore perhaps with the Port of Long Beach is perhaps an idea of having a sister port relationship with Shenzhen. I think it's something that Shenzhen is very interested in doing, and I think that would be very beneficial for us. So with that, I have a lovely picture of the Port of Shanghai here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Could you add a little bit on Taiwan outreach? You want me to do it?
Why don't you do it? You were involved.
So a few weeks ago, we went to the California Chinese American Environmental Association, and we had the Director General from Taiwan People's Republic of China?
No.
Or the Republic of China.
Yeah.
Republic of China.
Very different.
Yeah, sorry.
How
And
soon we forget.
Yeah. The PRC mainland, we have good relationships, but it was the first opportunity for us to meet with the Republic of China. And Evergreen is based in Taiwan. And one of the things that came out of that meeting was, in fact, Ian and Elaine Shen met with the Director General, and then who else from Evergreen?
Their vice president and some other port officials as well.
And they offered up their retrofit technology, and they offered up to work with us. So it's expanding beyond just China. We wanted to start with China because we knew that if we had China as a participant, everybody else would sort of follow in line. And so we're starting to see that. And I think that as more and more people become aware of this initiative, we're going to see Japan very interested. And then we also are reaching out to Vancouver. Maybe you can sort of touch on the Vancouver Northwest.
Sure, yeah. Before I do that, I'll talk. So Taiwan is important. If you remember the map, the key port there is also a big port for us in terms of at least their 2016 vessel calls. And then Evergreen, the shipping line that's based in Taiwan, they actually have a fairly big chunk of the containerized traffic that is in the Pacific Rim. So if you can get Evergreen on board and cooperating and working with us, I think that's a very important relationship for us. So what Port of Vancouver is doing is quite interesting, and it's very complementary to our efforts. They noticed the need to be, that there's incentive programs at ports, kind of not in a haphazard manner, but certain ports are developing incentive programs to try to attract cleaner vessels. But there wasn't a central platform where if I'm a vessel operator or a shipping line, I can figure out where all these incentives are. So maybe then I could program my route to hit these ports and optimize the incentives that are out there. So what they're doing is trying to build that platform where there's some database somewhere that all these incentive programs will feed into. So if I'm going to route a ship, I can then just figure out how many of these incentive programs I could capture on my route, or maybe even modify my route a bit to capture more of these. So I think that's very, very complementary to the work that we're trying to do.
So Bay Area is also very interested and has agreed to work with us on this. I think what's really important for them is within their 617 community, East Oakland has a tremendous impact by the ships coming into it. So this is another opportunity for them to look at getting reductions in their communities through an effort like this. So what makes it nice is that it's not just the efforts of South Coast. Now it's the efforts of 6, 7, potentially more other municipalities, localities to really pool their resources. And it's an opportunity for us to make sure that we're getting those emission reductions while they're here and not necessarily paying for everything everywhere else. So it's that consortium type concept that seems to be really gaining a lot of attention. People seem to like it. But as Dr. Rees has said, understanding the dynamic behavioral aspect and what is it going to take to get there, I think is important along with the technology. On the technology front, I'm very confident that we're going to be able to help drive that. And on the collaborative aspect, I think we're doing a good job this far.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rees and Mr. Nastri. I have a question. I think it was your very first or second slide, you stated that eventually 75% of all of our NOx emissions are going to be from ships. Now, here's what my question is. If we assume today we have 100% of NOx and 25%, and what we're saying now is coming, approximately 50% is coming directly from trucks in this particular slide, but eventually the trucks are going to, and the other equipment is going to fall off, and we'll be left the ocean-going vessels, which will then be contributing approximately 75%. Are you also implying that the amount of NOx itself is going to be going up, or the amount of NOx that is being emitted in our region that is being projected is going to remain the same, but we don't really have a viable means by which to eliminate that in proportion to that of the ships? I hope my question isn't convoluted, but what I'm trying to find out is the 75% going to be because it's going to be going up also at the same time, or is it because those others themselves are just going to be going down, and then of that 100%, 75% that is left will still be from ocean-going vessels?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of sources of NOx right in the basin, but a bunch of these are also going to be going down over time. It's the ships and the vessel emissions that are going to stay more or less constant, so they become a bigger share of the remaining NOx that we have in the basin. And again, because we have limited ways in which we can address it, that's why we're looking at ways in which we can kind of go outside the box a bit and have some voluntary mechanisms in place to try to get those reductions. But so it's really a function of we expect NOx overall is going to go down. Other sources are going to be decreasing because we have regulatory controls and other ways to get at those. But the ships that we expect, if we don't do anything, are going to be effectively constant and therefore make up a much bigger proportion of the remaining NOx.
So not 75%.
It won't be 75%.
So if I could clarify, Dr. Parker, this slide might be a little confusing. On the left, when we say 53% from ocean-going vessels, that's just the port emissions. That's not the basin emissions. So in 2015, about 53% of the NOx emissions from all the port-related sources was 53%. And because trucks are going to diminish and maybe locomotives diminish, we expect that to increase from 53% to a greater share, even as these other ones, maybe the total might contract. However, so it's not necessarily 75% of the basin wide, it could be more than 53% at the ports. On the right chart, that's not all of the sources that we have in the basin. Those are our top 5 sources in the basin. So we can extend that bar chart out and include a lot of other sources as well. So ships and commercial boats will be our largest source in 2023, but it's about 15% of the total NOx emissions.
So the trucks themselves, right now, is only about 20% and stuff of the NOx that is being emitted. So if we eliminated all of the NOx from trucks, we would still have 80% of NOx to deal with from other areas. Is that what this slide is
That's at the port.
really indicating?
At the ports. That's correct, Dr. Parker, but at the ports.
Oh, only at the ports?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Only at the ports. And what percentage of the ports then represents the NOx for our whole overall region?
That's $1 million question. Sorry.
Currently,
Yeah,
it's about 10%.
Yeah.
about 10%.
So, Dr. Parker, if I might add, I think that on the right-hand side of this chart, you can see the largest NOx category. You can see that actually ships and commercial boats are expected to increase a little bit, whereas all the other largest source categories are dramatically dropping. So it's a combination of shipping going up because of projected growth and the fact that we don't have controls, and then all the other sources going down because we do have controls.
But the left chart is ports only, the right chart is the whole basin.
I see. Okay. All right. It was a little confusing. That's what I was, because I was going to say, I had never heard that ships were representing 75% of the overall, but it's only of what's at the ports, not really what our overall basin is. Okay. Just last question, and then I'll let my other colleagues ask. What does it cost to retrofit one of these ships with some of this newer technology?
So
We talk about incentives. What kind of money are we talking about per vessel?
to retrofit to Tier 3 standards is very, very expensive, and it's one of the reasons why we're kind of not necessarily looking at running out and doing a bunch of SCR installs for retrofits, because it would be many millions of dollars to do that. The technology demonstration project we're looking at, we think that would be in the range of, when we're looking at kind of a $2 million project right now. We think that when we were able to get that more off the ground, that we could have something in the range of $1 to $2 million. Still expensive, but in terms of the overall cost of these vessels, not that huge of a deal. And we think, again, having a variety of incentive programs in place could make that something attractive to shipping line owners. I should mention, when I talk about incentives, we're not just focused on monetary incentives. There's also other types of incentives that you can have in place that can be very attractive to owners of shipping lines. For these guys, time is money. If they're able to turn around their vessel in a port much faster and not have to spend a bunch of time at anchor waiting for a slot at berth, that's very, very valuable to them. And so something like preferential berthing is another strategy that could be helpful. And I think one of the things we heard from talking with Evergreen was that one of the reasons they don't bring their cleanest ships, their most modern ships to our ports is that there's too much congestion and they spend a bunch of time having to turn them over. So that's, if we can get non-monetary incentives that are important to the shipping industry, that can be very helpful too.
Dr. Parker, if I can add one thing on cost. Under most of the scenarios we're looking at, even if a retrofit costs $1 million, it still seems to be more cost effective than currently what we're spending on trucks.
50% NOx reductions for $1 million.
That's really great.
It's an incentive dollar spent on some of the things we're looking at gets more reductions than an incentive dollar spent on our other programs, on trucks and trains. And
so what was the percentage reduction that you would get with the $1 or $2 million?
They're shooting for 50%.
Well, yeah,
50%.
Well, I think probably about 40%.
The slide said 50. I'm keeping it at 50.
Okay. All right.
we'll do all those calculations when we know the costs and figure out the incentive amounts. Make sure it's cost effective. That's
Okay, thank you. So I will let my other colleagues ask their questions. I'm quite sure they probably have many.
I do, of course, Dr. Parker, if I could jump in.
Go ahead.
I've taken on a second vocation with you folks of touring logistics industry facilities and ships, and we did a ship a while ago, and it was really educational. Among the things that I noticed was, as they're going across the Pacific, it was just kind of, here and there with the current, trying to take advantage of all that. Once they hit that, is it 200-mile limit when they have to go to low sulfur? Beeline, straight, right to the ports. And that was because the fuel's more expensive.
Yes.
It was really interesting because they had that whole thing of plotting out exactly what their path was, and you could see it when you were on the deck. The other thing I noticed when we were walking around the ship was they had a few things on the wall in terms of things that they have to pay attention to and abide by. And the only thing about air pollution was the IMO treaty, whatever it is, International Agreement on Prevention of Pollution from Ships, and Annex 6.
Annex 6.
It's their certificate, signed, everything. I took a picture of it. I was like, okay, this is what they care about. This is what's important to them. And a few years ago, I was told, I never was able to verify this, but that we had some impact on the establishment of the emission control areas because we convinced Senator Boxer to do legislation, not to pass it, but to introduce it, that helped put pressure on IMO to actually do something. And I'm thinking that I don't know what our next step is, but we should be thinking about being prepared to take advantage of that if we can leverage anything, because IMO seems to be the only thing that's going to be the mandatory stuff that they will pay attention to, the sticks side of things, the regulatory side of things. And I think we have to be thinking in terms of what can we possibly convince IMO to do above and beyond what they've committed to doing already that might help in the future. So I just bring that up because we talked about IMO early on in this. You talked about also understanding their behavior. I think I've been studying this very intently for many years, and it's down to three things: money, money, money. It's all what it's about. That beeline from the 200 miles straight to the ports, that's all about money. Everything in there was everything they were doing, everything I've learned, every decision. It's about the money. And so I wonder when we say that we are looking at trying to incentivize them to do something like put Tier 3 engines into a Tier 2 regulatory required keel, that ridiculous loophole that allowed them to build all those keels prior to the deadline. Have you guys looked at the financial issues involved in that? I mean, how much incentives would have to add up, and what is the cost of the Tier 3 engine versus the Tier 2 engine? Are there higher operating maintenance costs? Are there could we get not only if we add other ports beside Long Beach and LA into that loop, could they actually make it financially attractive to them, to do that? I mean, I don't know the numbers, but it would be really good to know. And then, also with the retrofitting too, I mean, that is a thing that might actually prove to be a better focus of the time and effort, depending on what the numbers say. It really comes down to math. And if you can put the math in front of these people and you can show them where the incentives are going to add up to cut their costs or provide money to them, they're going to go for it. And I think maybe it's the water injection. I mean, but I don't know what that does to efficiency and everything else. But it's all boils down to the money. So I would recommend paying very close attention to how the money goes on. I noticed that with the hoteling and anchoring emissions from the auxiliary engines, I mean, that does add up to a lot, and the boilers. That does add up to a lot of emissions. Now, the ARB regulation on shore power, right, it's going to get a lot of that, isn't it?
80% or more. That's the current proposal's 80%
That's right.
control, which could be achieved through plugging in, which is 100% control.
Well, not on the boilers.
Not on the boilers, that's correct.
Yeah.
But then you have the bonnet technology, which can get you close to
both.
90%.
Right.
So one thing we are looking at, I mean, the cost of retrofitting a ship for plug-in power is also in the millions
Right.
of dollars
Yeah.
range.
Right.
This is an alternative that may not get you 100% of those emissions, but overall it might be more emissions because you're not only getting it at berth, you're getting it at anchor, you're getting it in transit.
Right.
So it may, their CARB regulation might even drive the market to start looking at retrofits without even our consent. But hopefully we can help make sure the technology is available when that demand occurs.
Well, anyway, it just looked like there's a good opportunity there, and it showed the importance of the at-berth rule and perhaps the ship capture technology to get that. And I had one other thing. Oh, the conferences. I'm glad to hear that you guys were doing these conferences. I don't know if you participated in the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference a few weeks ago here.
We did not.
That's a really important one. It's right here in Long Beach, and all the retailers are there, all the cargo owners. The other thing I've learned is, when the source of that money are the cargo owners, right? So when it's money to these shipping companies, it depends on, entirely on who their customers are. And whatever those cargo owners ask of them, they will do. And that Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference that's every year here at Long Beach is a great opportunity. There's another one, I wrote it down, March 1 through 4, 2020. Then the National Retailers Federation, January 12th through 14th in New York. Retailer Industry Leaders Association, February 23rd through 26th next year in Dallas. All of those are opportunities. I looked it up. Retailers Industry Leaders Association had a at their conference, Is Sustainable the New Sexy, panel. And so they're that organization, at least talking about sustainability, as we could tell, like when we did the Amazon tour a couple days ago, they think a lot about carbon. They think almost nothing about criteria, air pollutants, and air toxics, right? So it would be good to get on those panels, to just be there, to get to know these folks, get to know the cargo owners, and help influence them in order to make sure these shipping companies are doing the right things, because the shipping companies will do whatever those cargo owners ask. And I think these conferences are a very good way to pitch these ideas, to go build the relationships and get them to come along. They would also help with things we try to do at IMO and so forth and so on. But it's encouraging to see the progress on this. It's a bit of a Hail Mary, but I think it's I can see the rationale and how it could come together. And I think it's important, if nothing else, to establish the relationships with the different ports and the Chinese government, both Chinese governments, to try to make this happen. So thanks for the update and the work, but those are my suggestions.
Okay. Anyone else? Mayor McCollum?
Just a couple of questions. How many of these ships are shipping companies, are Chinese companies?
I'm just trying to think. So there's been a lot of consolidation and reorganization in shipping industries, but the Chinese shipping lines are fairly significant, or there's quite a few of them out there. So COSCO is the biggest one. That's the state governments run shipping line. But there's also a variety of other ones out there as well that are Chinese owned.
And if the central government decides they want to make something happen, it'll happen with those lines.
And very quickly, yes.
Very quickly. Yeah. Also, I just wanted to point out, and I pointed out to you before, SCAG has very good working relationships with institutions in China, mainland China, and also in Korea, where we've established good relations in the scientific community, and through them with people in the government. And I would suggest coordinating something with them to see if there's something that the two of us might be able to work together to achieve our goals.
Thank you.
Are you working with Korean shipping lines at all?
We haven't yet. Again, our initial focus was within China, and a little bit with Taiwan, but Busan is a big port in Korea. They are also a key port for us, so it's something that we would look at.
And in terms of willingness, Maersk is one of the ones that's more willing to do something. So obviously keep working with them, because they have a very long-term view of their business, and they can afford to lose money in the short term if they're going to make it in the long term. And they're also showing a willingness to do sustainability things that others haven't.
Many of the cargo shippers, do they have similar regulations and rules as we do to comply with in China and some of these other ports that they go in and out of?
Yeah, not really. So you have IMO regulations that kind of apply worldwide, and I've described those a bit. Within China, they have more of a focus right now on lower PM control. So it's kind of looking at lower sulfur, eventually pushing that. But there's really not much in terms of the level of regulation that we have at our place. They're very interested in finding out more about what we do. They're super interested in what we've been able to do on shore power, but it's still kind of developing.
What of all the ports that the Chinese go into in America, is the West Coast the only place they have these kind of regulations? Are they equally applicable in New Jersey and on the East Coast as well?
So there are some regulations that not necessarily to the same level that we have that are also on our East Coast ports, and then there are also regulations in European ports where they have not necessarily emission control areas that are in place right now, but I know that there are some restrictions on certainly on sulfur limits at those ports. So and there's also concerns of some of the European ports about impacts to local communities, and so they're interested in promoting shore power, for example, for that as well. But I would say that we probably have the most comprehensive regulatory scheme for ships here in California.
Yeah, Dr. Parker, I think you've actually hit on something, because the competing West Coast ports will take out advertisements in the trade magazine saying, come here because we don't have regulations. So it really isn't fair to try to make our ports compete with those other ports. It'd be better to have an entire West Coast requirement that they had to abide by at all of the ports that they went to. We have certain advantages because of our huge infrastructure, our rail lines, our deep water ports that allow them to bring in the bigger ships, which saves them a lot of money. But that will ensure that we get a lot of containers moving through the San Pedro and Long Beach. But there is competition, and it gets kind of ugly when you see full page ads saying come to our port because you don't have to comply with the environmental regulation.
What percentage does the West Coast represent of the overall shipment into the United States? Does anyone know?
40%.
About 40. Yeah.
Just for
That's
us.
just for us contained, yeah.
50.
I was gonna say 50.
Yeah.
Yeah,
San Pedro, Long Beach, 40% overall, 50.
Count Canada, maybe.
maybe.
If you count, yeah, Vancouver.
Well, it's certainly, you were saying that absolutely what I was thinking, that one, if we have the predominant amount of the business that is coming here, and for whatever the reasons are, strategically, trucks, rails, and transportation to other parts of the United States, means that it's a necessity for them to come to our port. And therefore, the incentives then are going to have to be more on our side than it would have to be on the other side where they're going to be originating from, because those people there don't really have the regulations, not people, but those entities or whatever it may be. So we have to be very strategic in the way that we formulate what we're going to be doing as we kind of migrate across this, minefield that we have out here, because at any time someone could say, well, I'm going to not come there anymore, we're going to go here. But the cost then, it's have to get stuff to where the goods themselves need to be by truck is going to also be very expensive. So they might as well spend those extra dollars and come here, especially as Dr. Liu said, we have deep waters and they can bring the larger ships, the bigger bang for the buck. I certainly, Supervisor Bartlett, do you have questions?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. Well, any further questions by any of my colleagues? I want to thank staff today for such a great presentation. Do we have any comments from anyone there at CC8?
No comments.
Okay. Hearing none and no further questions by any of our colleagues. We have environmental documents received by our agency. Any questions concerning that particular written report? Hearing none. Any other matters, Mr. Nastri, that is going to
No,
come
sir.
before the complete thing? I want to thank everyone for showing up this morning, and it's been very informative. Thank you very much, Dr. Reese and Dr. Fine and Mr. Nastri. And our next meeting itself will be on April 19th, 2019. And with that, we'll call an adjournment to the meeting of today. Thank you very much for coming, and everyone have a nice weekend.